What if Ford built the perfect station wagon? Not the station wagon your grandmother drove to the grocery store, not the wood-paneled hauler that carried 3 kids and a dog to Little League practice, but a station wagon so far ahead of its time that it looked like it had driven straight out of a science fiction film and parked itself at the World's Fair. In the spring of 1964, that's exactly what happened. Ford rode a glowing, orange, futuristic wagon into the New York World's Fair, and the people who saw it that day never quite forgot it. It was called the Aurora, and it wasn't just a car. It was Ford's attempt to answer a question nobody else in Detroit was even asking. What if the family car wasn't just a way to get from point A to point B, but a room on wheels, a living space that happened to have an engine? To understand why the Aurora mattered, you have to understand what was happening to the American station wagon in the years leading up to it. Through the 1950s, the wagon had become the unofficial uniform of suburban life. Families were sprawling out of the cities and into the new subdivisions, and they needed something bigger than a sedan to haul groceries, lumber, camping gear, and kids. By 1961, station wagons made up nearly 17% of every car built in America. But by the early 60s, that number was sliding. Ford, in particular, was losing ground. It sat in a distant third place behind General Motors and Chrysler in wagon sales, and even the smaller Rambler brand was nipping at its heels. Ford's own wagons at the time were, frankly, a little dowdy. Practical, yes. Exciting, not so much. Something had to change, and Ford's stylists decided the way to change it wasn't with a new grille or a fresh paint color. It was with a total reimagining of what a station wagon could be. The man behind that reimagining was Gene Bordenit, Ford's vice president and director of styling. He called the Aurora a rolling laboratory of new ideas in styling and engineering, and he wasn't exaggerating. He openly admitted that a lot of what they were about to show the public was nowhere close to production ready. Some of it never would be. But that wasn't really the point. The point was to let the imagination roam free, to build something so packed with new ideas that even if only a fraction of them made it into showrooms someday, the exercise would have been worth it. And so, out of Ford styling studios came a car with 23 brand new concepts baked into a single body. 23. Most concept cars of the era were lucky to introduce 2 or 3 genuinely new ideas. The Aurora was a fireworks show of innovation, riding on a wheelbase of 131 inches, painted a bright, unmistakable orange, and given a name meant to evoke the rising light of morning. Aurora. The beginning of something new. Let's start where your eye would have started, right at the front of the car. Instead of the usual pair of round headlights, the Aurora used a bank of 12 tiny sealed beam micro lights stretched across the nose. It looked almost like the compound eye of an insect, mechanical and strange and futuristic. But there was real thinking behind it. Ford's engineers pointed out that with 12 small lights instead of 2 big ones, the system had built-in redundancy. If one bulb burned out, you still had 11 others doing the job. The lights could even be adjusted between different levels of brightness, dimming or brightening depending on what the driver needed. It was safety engineering dressed up as science fiction, and it's a philosophy you'll notice pop up again and again in this car. Nearly everything that looked flashy on the Aurora was also trying to solve a real, practical problem. Now look up, at the roof. This is where the Aurora really started to feel like something out of tomorrow. Ford built in what they called a polarizing sunroof, and the mechanism behind it was genuinely clever. The glass was made of sliding layers, and depending on how those layers were rotated relative to each other, the roof could shift from fully transparent to a deep, opaque green, all with the push of a button. When the layers lined up, light poured through unobstructed. When they were rotated 90 degrees out of alignment, the roof darkened and blocked the sun. No motorized shade sliding across a track, no fabric panel to wrestle with. Just a shift in the angle of polarized glass, and the whole character of the cabin would change from a sun-drenched greenhouse to a cool, shaded retreat. And once the sun went down, the Aurora had another trick up its sleeve. Along the body lines and lettering of the car, Ford installed electroluminescent panels, sometimes described at the time as cool light. This was phosphor-based lighting, a technology that glowed without generating the heat of a traditional bulb, and it traced along the car's contours like something out of a future that hadn't quite arrived yet. Picture the Aurora parked in a dark lot at the World's Fair, its body lines quietly glowing, that bank of 12 headlights up front, and you start to understand why crowds gathered around it. This wasn't a station wagon. This was an event. Getting into the back of the Aurora was its own kind of theater. Ford ditched the simple drop-down tailgate that every other wagon on the road used and replaced it with what amounted to a clamshell entry system. The lower tailgate folded down and became a carpeted step, inviting you up into the cargo area like the entrance to a little room. Above it, the glass liftgate didn't just swing open. It swung up and then slid back smoothly along tracks built into the roof, disappearing overhead instead of jutting out behind the car where it might catch a garage door or a low-hanging branch. It was elegant, it was mechanical, and it turned the simple act of loading groceries or gear into something that felt almost ceremonial. But the real showstopper of the Aurora wasn't up front, and it wasn't in the cargo area. It was what Ford built into the very back seat, a compartment designed entirely with children in mind. They gave it a nickname that stuck, the Romper Room. This was a dedicated, sound-isolated space just for the kids, complete with rear-facing seats so they could watch the world roll away behind the car, built-in storage for toys, and an independent audio system wired into the car's central television and radio setup. And here's the detail that really tells you how seriously Ford took this idea. The Romper Room could be completely sealed off from the front of the car using a power-operated glass divider. Parents up front, kids in the back, and if the noise level in either direction got to be too much, a switch on the dashboard could shut the door between the two worlds. Anyone who has ever driven a long family trip with restless children in the back seat can appreciate exactly how radical, and exactly how appealing, that idea must have sounded in 1964. Slide forward into the main cabin, and the Aurora stopped resembling a car altogether and started resembling somebody's living room. The front passenger seat was engineered to swivel a full 180 degrees, turning to face backward toward a curved, four-person sofa that wrapped through the middle of the vehicle. Suddenly you're not sitting in rows facing forward, watching the back of somebody's head. You're facing each other, having a conversation, the way you would in your own home. And sitting right there in the middle of that arrangement was a central console that looked like it belonged in a den, not a station wagon. It housed a television, a radio, a sound recording device, and a cooler with a refreshment cabinet built right in. Ford's own literature described it as a communications console, and the ambition behind it was clear. This was a car built for the idea that travel time didn't have to be dead time. It could be family time, entertainment time, even a chance to unwind with a cold drink while somebody else did the driving. Speaking of the driving, Ford didn't neglect the person actually behind the wheel. They built what amounted to a command post for the driver, a high-back, ergonomically shaped seat paired with a steering system unlike anything on the road. Instead of a full steering wheel, the Aurora used a low-lock steering bar that required just half a turn to go from lock to lock. Compare that to the multiple full rotations a standard steering wheel of the era demanded, and you start to see how much thought went into making the driver's job feel more like piloting a spacecraft than wrestling a station wagon through a parking lot. The dashboard carried its own bundle of experimental ideas too, including early indicators meant to help drivers manage turnpike speeds, and even rough, early concepts pointing toward what we would eventually recognize decades later as automated vehicle positioning. In other words, buried in this glowing orange wagon from 1964 were the faint, flickering seeds of technology we now take for granted: cruise control, variable ratio steering, and something that looks an awful lot like an ancestor of the GPS navigation system sitting in your car right now. So what actually happened to the Aurora after the fair? Here's the twist. It never came close to production. Not one single feature made it straight off this car and onto a dealership lot. And part of the reason has nothing to do with the car itself. That same World's Fair, that same Ford exhibit hall, also played host to the debut of another vehicle. A young Ford executive named Lee Iacocca stood up and introduced a sleek new coupe he promised would launch a whole new era of American driving. That car was the Mustang. History remembers the Mustang. The Aurora, glowing and strange and packed with 23 ideas nobody else had dared put in one car, quietly slipped into the shadows of automotive history, remembered mostly by collectors, museum archives, and people like you, curious enough to wonder what happened to it. But here's the thing worth sitting with as we wrap up. The Aurora wasn't a failure just because it never rolled off an assembly line. Ideas like its variable steering system and its early positioning concepts eventually found their way into real, mass-produced Fords over the following decades. And that whole notion the Aurora was built around, the idea that a family vehicle could be more than a box that moves people from place to place, that it could be a shared space, a lounge, a little bubble of comfort and connection on wheels, that idea didn't die with the wagon either. You can trace a straight line from that swiveling seat and that curved sofa all the way to the minivans that would define family travel 20 years later, and honestly, to the captain's chairs and fold-flat seating you'll find in family vehicles sitting in driveways today. Ford never built the perfect station wagon. But for one bright, glowing moment at the 1964 World's Fair, they built the idea of one, and pieces of that idea are still out there on the road, whether we notice them or not.